Chapter 1. Fleeing Carthage. Quick subtropical twilight descended upon the world, on the vast luminous sea, on the great Phoenician port city of Carthage, and on this quiet suburban garden of lofty palms, cypresses, cedars, tangled rose, vine, and oleander. The towering trees linked their branches overhead and cast deep shadows on everything below, on the small villa, on the garden paths, on the decorative fountains and statuary, on the enclosing wall. The web of shadows thickened, the shades grew darker, the silhouettes of the trees turned black. Night, humid, stifling, heavy African night, swallowed the world. Nehurabed stood at the open door of the villa. He watched the darkening garden and sky overhead, still glowing with the last remains of the day. He waited. Faint traces of expiring daylight illuminated his face, long and narrow, wrinkled and swarthy, his dark complexion contrasting sharply with the whiteness of his beard and bushy eyebrows. His face seemed aged at first glance, but his eyes, set deep under the eyebrows, were penetrating and quick, and his posture was alert and supple. His movements seemed infused with hidden and perfectly controlled energy. He was dressed in the Eastern fashion. He wore a black cloak which fell to his ankles, sandals on his feet, and a hood on his head. The hood and robe emphasized his height, lending him an air of lofty dignity. He stood there for a long time, watching and listening. When the night had grown dark enough, he pulled the hood tighter over his eyes, tucked a small brocaded bag and a short, fine dagger into the folds of his robe, glanced once more at the sky, now darkening fast, and stepped outside. Making not the slightest noise, he plunged into the tangled, sweet-scented darkness of the garden. He walked quickly, purposefully, along a path he had memorized during the day. Shortly he came to a place where a tall plane tree, broken by a recent storm, leaned against a garden wall. With agility and strength, surprising in a man his age, he used the branches of the fallen tree to raise himself onto the wall, and he sat there for a while, listening. He looked around carefully, but the darkness was already total. Once he assured himself that no one had followed him, he slid down the other side of the wall into the street below and set out briskly towards the city centre. It was not as dark in the streets of Carthage as it had been in the garden. There was bustle and commotion here, with people coming home from work and slaves driven back to their pens from their work at the port. Small groups of people stopped to eat and drink at outdoor stalls, while cries of revelling soldiers could be heard from a distance. Here and there was shouting, laughter, and music. Unsteady light of oil lamps spilled from open doors and windows onto the narrow street. Having reached an intersection, Nehurabed stopped to look around. Reassured that no one was following him, he turned into a street descending towards the shore. After leaving the residential quarter, he passed by the great workshops where magnificent Phoenician ships were built, sailing ships, barges, galleys, and the world-famous, terrifying, gigantic war triremes powered by hundreds of oars. Then, walking along the shore, he reached the fishing port. Here the beach was littered with small sailing boats hung with nets and ropes, under which he now and again had to duck. Voices came from all directions. Poor fishermen, not wanting to leave their belongings unattended at night, camped near their boats and nets. They slept in tents, improvised from sails, or right under their boats, turned upside down. Numerous shadowy figures gathered around campfires at which they fried their evening meal of fish and barley cakes, and chatted in voices animated by wine. Nehurabed moved slowly from one fire to the next, listening to the conversations. He walked for a long time before he heard the sound of Greek. He stopped, watched and listened. In front of him, 3 men sat by a small fire, lost in conversation. The man in the middle, apparently the most important of the 3, talked the loudest, gesturing widely, frequently bursting out in thunderous laughter. In a grand gesture of ownership, he leaned his back against the side of a beached boat. He must have been her owner, a sailor or a fisherman. Noticing the stranger, he fell silent. Nihurabed walked up to him. "You're Greek?" he asked. The Greek nodded. "And a sailor?" "Yes." "And the owner of this boat?" "Yes." "I want to talk to you alone." He said this in the tone of a man accustomed to issuing commands. Surprised, the Greek rose to his feet. His beautiful face, framed by a luxurious black beard, did not express concern. It was calm and composed. Nihurabed inspected that face carefully. They walked some dozen or so steps away from the fire to the very edge of the sea, silent, black, licking the beach with lazy waves. Nihurabed looked around once more and, seeing no one, explained his purpose. He meant, he said, to hire a good boat with a good pilot and sail to the Greek colonies in Sicily. Soonest. Tonight. Now, if possible. 2 conditions: haste and silence. He then named his price. A very good price. The Greek was silent. Haste and mystery. It sounded like an escape. He understood anyone who wanted to get out of Carthage in a hurry, but was leery of getting involved. He hated the Phoenicians, a nation of traders and robbers, cunning, crafty and vindictive. He hated them, as did all Greeks who competed with them for trade all across the vast shores of the Mediterranean Sea. They fought each other often, they argued even more. They traded with each other rarely, and only the hope of big profits could get him, a Greek, to visit this hateful city. This was not a friendly place for a Greek. Of course, he had to admit it, one couldn't get a better price anywhere else for his trading goods. Carthaginians were rich and prepared to pay for quality, and because they sailed all over the great mysterious western Okeanos and up and down those coasts, they offered goods no one else had. Trading with Carthaginians was one thing, but helping someone escape from the city was another altogether. Carthage was a powerful state, and her tentacles reached far and wide. No merchant would dare cross her lightly. If Carthage wanted a man, it was best to let her have him. On the other hand, the Greek had sold all his merchandise and already loaded his boat for the return journey, and since the weather was fair, he had planned to sail home to Syracuse the next day anyway. And now, a noble-looking stranger turned up and offered to pay him very good money to sail just a few hours ahead of schedule. That suited him. He hated the place anyway, and was happy to leave it yesterday. The Greek calculated. This stranger was not a Phoenician, and that was a good thing. But he was not a Greek either, a bad thing. Even though he spoke the language fluently, a good thing. He had an honest face and noble features, a good thing. And he was clearly an important person, therefore not some petty merchant, job supervisor, a thief in trouble, or a crook trying to set him up. All good things. All these thoughts crossed the Greek's mind as he studied Nihurabed, trying to guess from his words and his face the secret of this hasty departure. The conversation lasted for a while, but the Greek learned nothing beyond this. The stranger offered to pay well, really well. Finally, he made up his mind. His boat was ready, freshly caulked, with sail and rigging all prepared, and the weather was good. There was a light westerly wind, a bit weak, but blowing in the right direction. If the wind held up, one could reach the shores of Sicily in 1.5 days, 2 at most. He cast one more glance at the sky, calm, full of stars, foretelling no surprises, and shook Nehurabed's hand to seal the deal. In his rough sailor's hand, he felt the firm grip of a fine, soft, manicured palm, the gentle hand of a man who hadn't done manual work in many years. "This man is a great lord," he thought. They agreed on a midnight departure. The Greek's crew had yet to pack their belongings, while he himself had to go back to the city to collect money owed to him. He would return as soon as possible, within an hour, most likely, and they would then sail. Nehurabed promised to wait for him by the boat. He asked the Greek's name. The name was Callias. Nehurabed asked him to hurry and reminded him again to keep quiet about their deal. After the Greek's departure, Nehurabed stood lost in thought for a while, staring at the dark sea. Then he began to walk slowly along the shore. Lazy waves rolled at his feet, whispering softly in the dark. Nehurabed also seemed to whisper, as if in prayer. Noticing that the Greek had moved off some distance already and was about to disappear behind some campfires, Nehurabed suddenly changed direction and set off after him. He followed some distance behind so as to see and yet not be seen. He now had to quicken his pace because Callias was marching briskly. At times the old man lost sight of the Greek completely, but then he saw him again, a silhouette at the next fire or in the light of a lantern carried by a passer-by. In this way they walked around the fishing encampments, past the dockyards, and started climbing into the city again. The streets were winding and narrow, and climbed steeply upwards. In the side alleys, surrounded by high windowless walls, darkness was complete. Occasionally a hulking passer-by hurried past him, glancing at him cautiously. It was easy to get a knife in one's back in this darkness. Nehurabed was on the alert too, gripping the hilt of his dagger firmly under his cloak. He reached an intersection and stopped, unsure which way the Greek had gone. Callias's silhouette had vanished somewhere in the shadows. It seemed to him that the Greek had disappeared through a nearby gate, but he wasn't sure. He reflected for a while on what to do. At length he decided to wait there. Surely the Greek should return the same way he went. Nehurabed now stood in the shadows, almost invisible, calm, as still as a statue. Only his eyes watched every passer-by closely. He stood in this way for a long time. The lights around him began to dim, the murmurs of conversations quieting down with even fewer passers-by. The big city was slowly settling down for the night. Then, from behind a nearby wall, he suddenly heard a commotion. Raised voices, then a short, desperate scream of pain and terror, and then the loud noise of a quarrel. People started gathering at a nearby gate leading into a courtyard. Their silhouettes cast long shadows into the street. Nehurabed walked over to them. "What's all this about?" he asked. This time he spoke Phoenician as fluently as he'd spoken Greek before. Several voices answered him at once, hoarse, drunk, stuttering through laughter and hiccups. "What is this? Why, the usual. They're flogging a slave to death. For running away. Second time already, the pipsqueak. This time they will not spare him. To death. Look, they're starting." Nehurabed shuddered and looked glumly into the depths of the little courtyard where torture was about to begin. At a well, dimly lit by the flickering light of torches, lay a young prisoner, tied with ropes like a piece of smoked ham. He was completely naked, skinny, huddled, He gave the impression of being immature, practically a child. A gigantic slave stood over him with a flogging rod in his hand. The condemned man lay motionless. The executioner stood motionless. Their eyes were fixed on a group of speakers, several men standing nearby. Nihurabed also shifted his gaze in that direction. One of the men was a bald, fat Phoenician with cold, cruel eyes, contemptuous and resentful. He was the lord of this house, this courtyard, and this slave, about to be flogged to death. The second man, lively and restless, was explaining something to the first in a raised voice, arguing fiercely in broken Phoenician, swearing at the same time in Greek, Phoenician, Egyptian, and Etruscan, invoking all the gods of the world. 50 drachmas! 50 drachmas for a slave! He shouted. Nihurabed shuddered. He recognized the voice and came closer. Yes, this man, who now single-handedly filled the entire courtyard with the shouting of a dozen, was none other than his new acquaintance, the Greek Callias. "Oh, good people!" Callias cried, as if to call witness to the crowd around him. "What happened to the renowned wisdom of the shrewdest merchant this great city has ever had? Look here, I'm giving him 50 drachmas, you hear? 50 drachmas for a slave he wants to kill, and he refuses to accept. He does not want to accept 50 drachmas. Have you ever heard such a thing? Oh, holy Isis, Astarte, Athena, great mother of all gods, give this man his reason back, so that he may amaze us once again with his cunning. Oh, great and wise man," he went on, "what profit do you get from a dead slave? Even your dog won't feed on him. He is too scrawny. And here I am, giving you 50 drachmas. Think about it. Think, oh, you greatest of all merchants, what you can buy with 50 drachmas. The Phoenician shrugged and pushed the Greek away. "Why all this talk?" he said coldly. "Give me 100 drachmas, or let's forget the whole thing now." Callias gasped in indignation and raised his hands heavenward. 100 drachmas? For what? Oh, gods, for what? For a dead slave? He is not worth anything to you any more. He is as good as dead." The Phoenician scoffed angrily. "Why do I want 100 drachmas?" he growled. "Why? Because you are trying to deprive me of my revenge. This dog dared to run away from me, twice. On Moloch, killing him is worth 100 drachmas to me. Besides, he is a Greek, and you are a Greek, so you will pay. Pay me 100 or shove off." And with an impatient hand he pushed Callias away, and motioned to the executioner to begin. Callias wiped sweat from his brow and tugged at his beard in helpless rage. He was panting. The unhappy slave, a young boy, a child almost, looked at him with despair. Callias cursed. 60 drachmas, he stammered out. "I give you 60 drachmas." But the Phoenician was not listening. The sharp whistle of the rod cut through the air, and was answered by a cry from the condemned boy. Nihurabed approached Callias. "I'll give you the 40 drachmas, he said softly. "Redeem the boy." Callias looked at him astonished, as if he had just seen a ghost. But he didn't waste any time on reflection. He grabbed the merchant's arm. "I'll give you your 100 drachmas, blast you," he exclaimed through a choked throat. "I'm giving you your 100 drachmas. Here, untie the slave." Melicles, for that was his name, walked with his saviours, bewildered and half dreaming. Blood dripped from his back from the terrible blows of the rod, but he felt no pain. He was alive. He was breathing. He inhaled the cool breeze from the sea, heard the eternal crash of the waves, and joyful sobs squeezed his chest. He couldn't understand what had happened and why. He was not only alive, but he was free. How did it happen? How could it have happened? Who were his saviours? He had never seen either man before. He was dumbfounded. He was confusion itself. After a year of terrible captivity, after 2 hopeless attempts to escape, after so many futile endeavours, pleas and curses, after torture and misery, and now the terror of inevitable death. Now, suddenly, this. Salvation. Where did salvation come from? So, gods existed after all. Zeus existed and answered prayers. So there was goodness, there was hope, there was grace. The boy was trembling. He wanted to fall on his knees before his saviours, to kiss their feet, but he did not dare do it. They walked swiftly in silence. Only Callias gasped with anger and agitation. Then he glanced suddenly at the old man walking next to him. "How did you get here, my lord?" he asked. Nihurabed didn't answer right away. "I wanted to find out where you were going," he said at last. "Were you really going to collect your money? Or were you perhaps going to report me?" "You didn't trust me, my lord." Callias felt offended and pounded his oversized fist against his powerful chest. "All Syracuse knows to trust my every word, as if it were the word of the sacred Pythia herself." The old man nodded. "From now on, I, too, will trust your word," he said simply. Then, pointing to Melocles, he asked, "Is that your relative?" Callias jumped as if burned by a branding iron. "My relative? Such a lame shrimp, such a loser, such a weak, headless, heedless fool who allows himself to be caught into slavery. And not once, but 3 times in a row? Oh, ye gods! If I had such a relative, I would cry for shame. And to think that I paid 60 drachmas for a loser like this, when he's not worth a broken obolos. By Hermes, I swear I never made a worse deal, never. And all of this just because my heart is too soft, and my luck is rotten. Like I really needed to get there just as they started on his back. And why? 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 If only I had not turned up, everybody would now be better off. The world would contain 1 fool less, and I would be 60 drachmas richer." He gasped angrily. "Am I your slave, my lord?" Melocles asked softly. "A slave? No. A Greek will never be the slave of a Greek. At least not in my house. No, you're free, and you can run wherever the demons take you. But if you do, you will be the most ungrateful thief in the world, and Zeus the Thunderous will burn you with living fire. Do you understand?" "I understand, my lord." The boy choked with joy. "I understand, and will serve you as long as you want, and I will be grateful to you for the rest of my life." "If it weren't for me, you shrimp, they'd be burying you there in the garden by now, or feeding you to the dogs." They walked on in silence again. 60 drachmas, Callias muttered to himself. 60 drachmas. "Perhaps, my lord, my mother will be able to pay you back this sum." "What? Who? Your mother?" asked the Greek in a much softer tone. "Do you have a mother? Where is your home?" "In Miletus, all the way in Ionia, in Asia." And Phoenicians snatched you from there? Callias asked in disbelief.
No, my lord. After my father died, my uncle took me from Miletus to Parthenope. That's the Milesian colony on the Campanian shore, you know.
Of course I know, muttered Callias. I wasn't born yesterday. Parthenope. And sometimes they say Neapolis. I've been there. There is a large volcano there, and they claim, liars, that it is the site of the forge of the great god Hephaestus. Even though, of course, everyone knows that Hephaestus's forge lies in Sicily under Mount Etna. Is that where the Phoenicians got you?
Yes, my lord. Not Phoenicians. Pirates. They attacked us while we were on our way back to Parthenope from Massalia.
From Massalia? From Neapolis by sea to Massalia? Don't lie, you little brat. Tell the God's honest truth, and do not confuse matters. It's 1,000 miles from Neapolis to Massalia.
I am telling the truth, my lord.
Well, that you are from Miletus. This could be because you sing and draw out your words like an Ionian. I have a good ear for accents, and will recognise an Ionian clear across the square on a market day. And then he burst out again. My gods! So, fates drove you all the way from Miletus here, to my misfortune. He fell silent, but not for long. It was evidently not Callias's custom to remain silent. How long ago was that? He asked again.
What, my lord?
You're getting kidnapped, of course.
1 year ago.
And you people couldn't defend yourselves?
We defended ourselves, my lord, to the death. 6 of us were left out of the crew of 15. But the pirates had 2 ships, over 60 men. We fought hard, my lord. I myself killed 2, I think, but I passed out from my wounds. Then they took me.
And they sold you in Carthage?
Yes, sir.
Callias stopped panting. His anger was slowly leaving him. How old are you? He asked at last when he calmed down.
I'm past 16.
And you killed 2 pirates?
I am strong, my lord.
Callias looked at the boy's small stature and shook his head doubtfully. Oh, never mind, he muttered to himself. In your place I would have said 3. They arrived at the shore. The boat was ready to go. It just needed a push onto the water. Final preparations were made in silence. Everything around was asleep. There was only one light all along the shore now, the great fire in the watchtower. That light was lit each evening and kept up all night as a guide for ships far at sea. The night was calm and moonless. Nihurabed couldn't have chosen a better time for his mysterious departure from the city. He happily settled at the bottom of the boat, now being pushed with strong hands, slowly sliding off the sandy shore and into the sea. He heard with intense relief the splash of the water, parted by the prow, and the flapping of the sail. It seemed unlikely that the harbour guards might notice someone leaving the city in this darkness, or that anyone might spot a single grey sail melting away into the night. Callias was a skilled sailor, and knew the harbour well enough to clear the entrance to the port, even in pitch dark. Half an hour passed. No one said a word, only their hearts beat anxiously. Finally, Callias took a deep breath, as if dropping a huge weight off his chest. He looked back. The light on the watchtower faded into the distance. All around them was now only night, silence, and the deep, dark sea. "Let's thank Poseidon, comrades," he said in a firm voice. "Carthage won't catch us here any more." Then he turned to Nihurabed. "Lord," he said, "I understand everything, yet there is one thing I cannot comprehend.
I paid 60 drachmas to save this worthless shrimp because he is a Greek. And me, well, I am a Greek also. But you, my lord, why did you do it?"
The old man looked up at him thoughtfully.
"Because he is a man, and I am a man also," he said at last.
Chapter 2. This is a bad place. Night. Silence. The immeasurable depth of the sea beneath your feet. The immeasurable depth of heavens above your head. A gust of wind hardly moved the sail. The dark masses of water shifted like a great slithering beast under the boat, rocking it softly, gently. Rest. A moment of respite amid the dormant terror of the sea. An ordinary sailor's night. Mellocles was awake. He leaned against the mast, seeing the prow of the boat in front of him, its dark contours rising and falling steadily against the bright burning stars. Above his head, above the square sail, he saw the great swathe of the Milky Way. He stared at the stars with such intensity that tears welled up in his eyes. He shook off the tears, but then they welled up again. Let them flow. There was too much joy. There was so much joy that one had to shed a few tears. To see the sea and the boat and the stars, and to know that one would see them tomorrow too, and the day after tomorrow, and always. To live and to be free. Oh, gods! How terrible it was to die when you were 16, and how wonderful it was to be alive when you were 16. He had been born in Miletus, a large port city in faraway Ionia, which was a swathe of Greek settlement on the western shores of Asia Minor. He spent his childhood there, grew up and studied there right up to the age of 12. He learned various sciences, reading and writing and rhetoric, or rather, one should say, declamation of heroic poems, and gymnastics and swimming, just like all the other Greek boys in Miletus at the time. Miletus was then the leading city among Ionian cities, and the Ionians were the leading tribe among the Greeks. Mellocles' father, Lycaon the sailor, a brave sailor and a fisherman, ensured that his eldest son was as well educated as the sons of other, wealthier citizens. At the same time, he taught his boy one more science, above and beyond those learned by all the others. He took him along on his boat, on long journeys, on fishing expeditions, and he taught him the knowledge of the sea. This practical study was the best and quickest way to learn. By the time he turned 12, Mellocles was already a proficient sailor. He knew the habits and vagaries of the sea, and could read sunrises and sunsets. He knew how to understand the shapes of clouds, the gusts and directions of winds, the sound of the waves and the swelling of tides, how to understand their language and warnings. Then, suddenly, everything changed. When Mellocles was 12, his father died. He disappeared in a storm at sea. His ship, the pride and mainstay of his sailing life, perished with him. Then came the difficult times, great sorrow, great poverty. Mellocles' uncle, a sailor and a merchant, took the boy with him on a journey to Greater Greece, a string of settlements at the sole of the Italian boot. And then they went farther, to the recently founded settlement of Parthenope, otherwise known as Neapolis. That journey was supposed to take 6 months, but his new guardian, Mellocles' uncle, was lured by the good earnings in the Tyrrhenian Sea, and decided to settle in the new colony. They spent the next 3 years there, taking coastal trips, carrying people and goods from Neapolis to Cumae, to Messenia, to Elea or Taranto, reaching twice the shores of Gaul in adventurous expeditions far north. This was Melicles' new life and new school. He almost forgot reading and writing, but he learned his sailing like no one else his age. He wanted to go back to his family in Miletus more than once, but his uncle, a stern and ruthless man, enjoyed the boy's free labour and did not let him go. And so Melicles kept putting off the date of his return. And so years passed. On their last trip to the recently founded colony of Massalia on the shores of southern France, in the middle of the night their boat was attacked by pirates. His uncle died in the ensuing battle. Melicles saw him die. He himself fought to his last breath. He was knocked down and overpowered. He struggled to free himself, biting his attackers like a young wolf. At last, wounded, he passed out from pain and fell into enemy hands. And then the hellish life of a slave began. In the next few months, he was taken from one human market to another. Floggings, chains, and hunger were to teach him obedience, fear, and blind, dog-like submission to his new masters, the Phoenicians. They intended to teach him obedience, but in this they failed. His haughty soul snarled. His pride raised its horned head after each humiliation. Instead of asking his masters for mercy, he asked Zeus for revenge. Instead of raising his hands in supplication to his masters, he clenched his fists. He tried to escape twice. After the first time, he was beaten unconscious, and it took him a month to recover. The second time, he was sentenced to death, this death from which he had now been saved in the last moment. Such was the story of Melicles. Sunrise found them on high seas. The sky was cloudless but dull and hazy. The wind died down. Its faint gusts now barely flapped the sail, and the boat moved so slowly that Callias began to doubt whether they could reach the shores of Sicily before nightfall. There was nothing for it, he thought, and, tired after a sleepless night, he woke Melicles, then cursed the steersman roundly for dozing at the helm, and, making himself a bed among the sacks of cargo, went to sleep. The boat ploughed on. It was a typical Greek sailboat of those days. Its prow was slightly raised, its stern was wide, and it had one mast. A broad square sail hung from its horizontal beam, tied at the bottom corners with straps of coconut fibre to the sides of the boat. The steersman's broad rudder was at the stern, at least 3 times as wide as a normal oar. A pair of oars were strapped to the sides. Those were used only to manoeuvre the boat once in a harbour. Little boats like this were used for fishing or coastal navigation, rarely for longer expeditions. But Callias was a bold sailor and an enterprising trader. He had hoped to earn well by trading in Carthage, and he did. And then he picked up a paying passenger into the bargain. It was shaping up to be a great trip for him. Gradually the sun rose higher. The sea rocked them gently, lapping their sides with lazy clapping. The helmsman looked at the sleepy sea and sky, and decided that this apparent peace did not bode well. A change was certain, and within the day, and in any event, before they reached Syracuse. Melicles was not frightened by the helmsman's predictions. He had become familiar with the sea like few others. During his short life, he had experienced many storms at sea, and he knew that for a good sailor in a strong boat, the high seas, far from treacherous reefs and shallows, were perhaps safer than land. With the sure eyesight of the child of the sea, he had already judged the boat and its master, and he knew the boat should bear the heaviest blows of weather, and the pilot would serve it well. Besides, how could he be afraid of a mere storm? He, who had been beaten for a year, who had prayed for death and looked for it in hopeless attempts to escape. Why, he would have found his death yesterday had it not been for his unexpected deliverance. And now he was not only saved, but he was free. He was getting closer with every passing hour to the land of the Greeks, and with it to his homeland and his mother. The prospect of having to face a storm at sea did not frighten him. Yesterday he had been surrounded by slaves and beastly slave drivers, a fate 100 times worse than any storm, and today his saviours were with him. Their kindness overwhelmed him with reverence and admiration. He was deeply moved, and gratitude brought tears to his eyes. He recognized Callias. The man reminded him of his own father, who had also concealed a noble and devoted heart under a quarrelsome mask. As for the other, the distinguished old man, silent as a statue, his figure filled the boy with reverence and dread.
"He's some great dignitary or sage," he whispered to the helmsman.
"Or a priest," said the other. A couple of hours passed without any incidents. The wind was lazy, soft, intermittent, as if it too fainted in the day's rising heat. About the second hour of the day, that is, 2 hours after sunrise, they woke Callias. They noticed the outlines of some land on the far right horizon. A strip of sandy hills just barely visible from the boat shone like a golden thread between the blue of the sky and the blue of the sea. Upon seeing it, Callias turned the boat northeast, and the land vanished from sight.
"What was that land?" Melocles asked.
"Carthage."
"Carthage? Still?"
"Yes, boy. Why, does your back smart at the mention of the name?" Then, lifting his finger upward, he said gravely, "Carthage, you see, sits deep in its bay like a dragon in his lair, or, better yet, like the hungry throat of a viper in its wide-open jaws. These jaws are wide open because, the throat is always hungry. What we saw was one of its jaws, the eastern arm of the bay, jutting far out to sea."
"And that arm belongs to Carthage too?"
"Who knows exactly to whom it belongs? The land is empty. It's just so much sand. But the Phoenicians have built trading posts and watchtowers all along this shore. There are pirates here too, because they come to do business with Carthage. This is not a good place."
"Aren't they afraid of the guards?"
"Oh, the pirates? Why, they and the Carthaginians work together like brothers. You should have learned it on your own hide, no? The pirates soldier to the Phoenicians, yes? Well, they prefer not to go to Carthage openly, although it does sometimes happen too. But here, on these empty sandy banks, they can do their dark business with Carthaginians. Oh, this is not a good place." This was true. Pirates, whose nests were scattered all over the Mediterranean Sea, often came to Carthage to sell their captives and resupply their ships. Hated by sailors, these men were terrors, not only for travellers but also for smaller coastal towns. Yet they never seemed to pick a fight with Carthage. What's more, by some strange coincidence, their attacks and robberies tended to focus on those who had displeased the great city, especially the Greeks, whose dash, energy, and enterprise often hurt Phoenician trading profits. The Greeks suffered the most as a result of these attacks, and many thought this happened with the tacit understanding of Carthage and of the Great Phoenician Council. Carthaginians were alarmed by the rapid development of Greek colonies in the west. Fearing an open war with them, having neither a martial population like the Greeks nor a large army, they supported pirate gangs by giving them weapons and money to fight the hated Greeks. And thus, at a stroke, they achieved two benefits. They undercut Greek trade, and at the same time, they acquired new slaves. The trade in slaves was one of the main sources of wealth for the Phoenicians. Their leading cities, Carthage in Africa and Tyre in the Levant were at the time the largest human markets in the known world. Desperate Greeks defended themselves from pirates as well as they could. Battles raged on land and sea, and so it had been for many years throughout the western part of the Mediterranean. No sailor could sail without a shudder by places frequented by pirates. Therefore it was not surprising that Callias so hastily steered clear of this bad place. And it was not surprising that he became alarmed when he spotted 2 large ships sailing in front of them. But these sailing ships came from the north, from the side of Sicily, stayed far away, and disappeared quickly over the horizon. Seeing them, Callias nodded his head appreciatively. "Ordinary merchant boats. Wise, understanding sailors. Check out these tricksters. 2 boats going together for safety, and rightly so. With even one of those ships the pirates would have had their hands full. But with 2, that's smart. I like it." Then pointing to his own boat, he added, "The worst thing is this kind of a barrel. Just big enough to hold trading goods, but too small to fight." Melicles shook his head. "It's a nice boat, Lord. My father had a similar boat." Callias looked at him curiously. "Your father had a boat? Was he a merchant?" "No, he was a fisherman, but he had a boat." "He had his own boat?" Callias looked at the boy with a lot more respect now. "And what happened to him?" "He died in a storm. I was 12 at the time." Callias nodded. "Ordinary thing with a sailor," he muttered. Then they started talking about different kinds of boats, barges and galleys, about the difference in shipbuilding here and in distant Miletus. They distinguished between deep sailing ships adapted for grain transport, from the shallower but rounder-bellied barges intended mainly for the transport of horses and cattle. Some of these ships, in addition to the one great mast with a huge square sail, also had a second mast, slightly tilted forward, with a more triangular sail. This was the new Phoenician invention. Most of these big cargo ships, in addition to the sail, also had 20 to 40 rowers below deck, so that their locomotion did not depend entirely on the whim of the wind. Callias talked about the great warships with high sides, sometimes with 2 or even 3 decks, and perhaps 60 rowers per side, in 2 and sometimes 3 rows, one above the other. He had seen such ships in Athens, Syracuse, and in hated Carthage. Melicles had never seen such ships up close, but he described the pirate vessel which had captured him, which was like a hybrid of a trading ship and a warship. It was wider, with only 1 row of rowers, but the prow had an underwater spur, a kind of ram with which to break other boats, and a tall overhead platform from which soldiers could jump down on their prey. Callias was surprised that, despite his young age, the boy knew so much of the sea and could talk about it confidently like an old sailor. "He's one smart barley cake," he said to himself appreciatively. Hours passed in silence. The heat continued to rise. Towards noon, they spotted 2 sails on the horizon. This time, however, it was one ship, and it came from the south, from the bad side. And it caught up with them very slowly but steadily. There was some commotion on the boat. "That's the bad side," whispered Callias, staring at the faint silhouette of the ship. "Phoenicians?" "Hades knows. Could be Carthaginians, or could be pirates. I told you, here one meets both." "Or maybe they are ordinary merchants." "Maybe. Many merchant boats run through here. Many sailors." This consoled them somewhat, but the strange ship never strayed out of sight of their boat. An hour later, as the strange ship drew even closer, Callias said with some anxiety in his voice, "I don't like this. She's coming in too fast. We ride on the wind alone, but they also row. Why are they in such a hurry? Who rows with the wind in the back? A narrow, large galley with sails, just like they build them now in Cyprus and Sidon. An expensive ship. An ordinary sailing ship would not be flying so fast in this ridiculous wind. This is a government ship, a military ship. No merchant would spend that kind of money just to add a little speed to his goods. Look, in this dead wind, we can barely drag ourselves for pity's sake. And they— Here he fell silent, shaded his eyes with his hand from the glare of the sun, and stared towards the approaching sails. The helmsman stood by his side. They gazed together, silent for a long time. "By Hades and the Erinyes," he cursed again. "Rip out my guts and eat them raw if I ever set out for another trip on this God's blasted nutshell. Righteous Zeus! In 2 hours they will be upon us. Or earlier,
If the wind doesn't change.
or if they are chasing us at all."
Make a sharp turn, and let us see if they follow us.
Callias shook his head. "No, I don't want to lose the rest of our speed. We're going too slowly as it is. If they are chasing us, we will soon find out."
Nehurabed interjected. Are they Phoenicians?
"Yes."
Ordinary merchants, for sure.
Callias shrugged. "Not going on sail and all like this." As he said this, he looked sharply in the face of Nehurabed, but the old man did not flinch. He asked,
Where do the Carthaginian Coast Guard boats come from?
"They keep boats at both ends of the bay. If they see something suspicious, or if they want to pursue, they can send those boats."
But they couldn't have seen us.
"We saw the land, yes. So they could have seen us too."
So, do they send a ship after every boat?
"No, but if they saw us in the early morning, it would have meant that we left Carthage at night, and that is suspicious."
All right, but it's still too little of a reason to send a large ship like this out of curiosity.
What if they received an order from Carthage to be on their guard? Callias looked intently at Nehurabed, but was disappointed again. The old man's wrinkles remained perfectly still. Nehurabed smiled slightly.
So, Greek, do you think this is a pursuit sent after me?
"I don't think anything, my lord, but you would know better." Callias observed his passenger closely. Nehurabed shook his head.
It can't be, he said. How could the city of Carthage have notified the guards at the Cape so quickly?
"Well, horsemen can travel from the city to the trading post in a few hours."
Then the pursuit would have begun only now.
"They go fast, those fellows on the boat."
"Yes, but to be here now, they would have had to leave port at least 5 hours ago."
"Well, yes, I don't know exactly how long it takes for a horse to travel from the city to the end of the bay. But people also say that the Phoenicians can send messages to each other remotely." Nehurabed looked up at him sharply, a little curious this time. "Yes, my lord. People say they can signal with lights. They can send a message from one post to another as needed."
"I saw fires at night, far behind us, to the south."
"Why didn't you tell me?"
"The light was very distant, and the day was already breaking, and I didn't think it was important."
They fell silent. Callias shifted uneasily. Nehurabed walked away, sat still, his eyes narrowed into slits. And everything was as before. The boat ploughed on lazily, barely swaying on the serene waves. The water splashed and gurgled against their sides. The sail flapped lightly, then hung down impotent, then flapped a little again. The heat continued to rise. The sun had passed the zenith, and was starting to lean towards the west. The strange boat was getting closer and closer. "They'll be upon us in an hour," the helmsman said softly. "They will catch up with us before night-time. Gods!" Callias paled a little and began to wring his hands. "Maybe they are ordinary merchants. Maybe they are ordinary merchants," he repeated, biting his lips. Melocles walked over to him. He was pale, his eyelids trembled for a moment, and he seemed about to break out in tears like a child, but he controlled himself. Then his face became hard, calm. "Do you have a sword?" he asked. Callias looked at him in surprise. "Weapons are useless here," he replied slowly. "That boat has 20, maybe 30 rowers, maybe 10 crew. There are 5 of us." Melocles frowned and lowered his head. His eyes darkened in anger. "I have sworn to almighty gods," he said in a muffled voice, "that I would not allow myself to be taken again. Never again. I want to die with a sword in my hand. I pray to all gods there in Carthage. All gods. Gods, listen to me. Give me a sword, good sir." There was a moment of silence. Callias examined the boy carefully. He shook his head. "It's good that I didn't leave him there to die," he thought, but he didn't answer right away. In truth, he wasn't even sure if these people were Carthaginians or pirates. That they were going in the same direction, well, that obviously didn't mean a thing. He recalled many such events from his own past, and until now, all those worries had turned out to have been unnecessary. "They might be some peaceful sailors," he said. "What if they are not?" "Then we think what to do. By all gods, no one ever accused Callias of cowardice. But you can only fight when you can win, or at least save your skin." "I will not be taken alive again. I'd rather die." "Don't be too hasty. We still have time. And if push comes to shove, well, the wise god Hermes created money so that we can redeem ourselves, just in case. I didn't regret drachmas for you once, yes? You think I'll try to save money this time?" The boy fell silent and only scowled at Callias, but it was easy to tell that he had not changed his mind. The older Greek stared at the strange ship, still distant but growing in his eyes. It was long, like a viper, low and narrow. It had 2 low masts with wide squares of sails. The boat was going mainly by the strength of the rowers. There were at least 20 of them. "You can already see their oars," Callias shouted, stamping his foot and flushing with anger. "A curse on this wretched boat of mine, and on this filthy weather, and on all of this. Damn this trip. Oh, gods, look!" The wind came to a complete stop. Their sails sagged like an empty sack. "For Hermes! They are already upon us. If only we had a little wind. Then we could wait for the night and slip away in the dark. If only we had a little wind. Blow, you damn thing! Blow!" Indeed, the sea had clearly darkened. The night was still many hours away, but the sun had gone behind a wall of yellow-grey haze that had risen over the western horizon. The light of day shone through this smoke, a dirty yellowish glow, strange and mysterious. "The storm is upon us too," said the helmsman. "Let it come quickly," Melocles almost shouted. "It's coming," Callias repeated, "but will it come in time?" He glanced again at the strange boat and at the overcast horizon. The sky grew rapidly darker. A sudden wind rose, giving their boat speed. "Oh, Poseidon!" Callias cried, raising his hands towards heaven. "O thou all-powerful Lord of the seas! O brother of the highest! Save us, your children! Is it possible that you would allow us to be taken back to Carthage, to be despoiled by the hideous Phoenicians who mock you? Have they ever offered you a single heifer? Not one, I am sure. O Poseidon, consider this." A distant thunder answered him. This made a suitable impression, but the thunder was very far away. Callias shook his head. "It's all for nothing," he said. "The storm will be here in an hour, and they'll be here in half an hour, or sooner." Indeed, the strange ship was now close enough for them to make out individual faces of armed men on its deck. Her sails hung helplessly, but the evil tentacles of her oars moved rhythmically, driving her on. She looked like an evil beetle rushing towards them on the water. "Rogues, robbers, bandits!" Callias shouted. "Look how they rush!" He began to tear at his beard again. Then he knelt down and pulled 2 old rusty swords from the bottom of the boat. Their pursuers were now no farther than a few thousand steps. "We are done for," he moaned. "We are lost! Oh, Zeus!" "No, we are saved," answered the helmsman suddenly, leaning into the rudder. Everyone looked at him in amazement. The boat turned around and came to a full stop. "What are you doing, fool?" Callias roared. The helmsman did not answer, only pointed to the north, and then began to untie hurriedly the straps of the sail. The sea to the north of them, still calm and smooth, suddenly became covered with a multitude of small white wrinkles approaching them quickly. 1 minute more, and a great gust of wind blasted the sail. The mast creaked with a violent heave, and the boat, like a horse smacked by a whip, jumped forward. But the strange ship, not prepared for the unexpected gust of wind, suddenly tilted to one side and swung around, coming to a full stop. Screams and shouts from the ship came to the ears of the Greeks through the roar of the gathering wind. But only for a moment, because another powerful gust of wind suddenly put a lot of sea between them. And now all pursuit would be futile. The wind increased again. The sky turned even darker. Rain broke. A veil of rain covered the horizon. Grey, dirty clouds rushed forward in front of a navy-blue curtain of the storm. Waves rose suddenly, became huge mountains, and began to toss the little boat. Everything, the whole world, suddenly started into a mad, unstoppable dash. The mast creaked under the pressure of the wind, the prow began to hammer the waves, and the waves began to break over the sides. Callias and Melocles dropped the sail halfway and loosened its ropes. Their boat ran forward like a racing hound. Then a torrential downpour hit them, and the whole world disappeared behind the wall of rain. Now they could only see the waves running right in front of them, blown by the wind, roaring, heaving, splashing, foaming, crashing. Suddenly it was totally dark, and a flash of lightning tore the sky. 1, 2, 3 thunderbolts. A terrible northwestern storm was upon them. The rain and the wind turned icy cold, and the sailors' hands holding onto the boat became numb. The helmsman leaned into the rudder with all his strength. Melocles and the third member of the crew, a Libyan boy, furiously bailed water, now ankle-deep, and splashing again and again over the sides as the boat rocked and pitched. They clung to the boards and ropes in the dark to not fall overboard. To fall overboard now into the black, boiling, raging sea would have meant certain death. But Melocles knew this storm, the crazy dance of the deck. He gritted his teeth, fell, scrambled up, fell again, was up again and again and again, but did not stop bailing. Whoosh! A new wave washed overboard. Whoosh! The boat was full again. They bailed and bailed. The water would not stop coming, but they would not stop bailing. There was a wild exhilaration in the struggle with the terrible element. O sea, O wind, we will not give up." The old man tried to help, but stumbled almost immediately, fell, and nearly tumbled overboard into the darkness. Melocles gave him a rope to tie himself to the bench at the bow of the ship, and the old man gave up on further attempts to cooperate. Hours passed. The storm kept on raging. Callias took over the rudder from the exhausted helmsman, and handed the care of the sail to Melocles. At first he watched anxiously to see if the boy could handle it, but after a while he relaxed. Despite his young age, Melocles was an experienced sailor. His hand was sure, his arm strong, his eye watchful. "My son will grow up like this," thought Callias. Around midnight, the storm stopped at last, and the wind eased. Callias corrected their course for Sicily, and watched Melocles reset the sail. "Definitely worth the 60 drachmas," he muttered to himself. The danger was over. When the day broke, there was no trace of the strange ship, no sailing ship of any kind anywhere in sight. Nothing around but the sea, still restless, heaving, here and there scarred by a foaming crest, but no longer dangerous, and gradually growing calmer. A strong, even westerly wind now carried them straight to their destination, north, towards the shores of Sicily. "The first thing we do when we arrive in Syracuse will be to offer a white heifer to Poseidon. He saved us today," said Callias. "He answered my prayer. He sent the storm to save us from pirates." He fell silent and thought for a moment, after which, because he regretted the cost of the heifer, he turned to the old man. "You too, sir, should contribute to the purchase of this heifer. You too were saved by the mighty brother of Zeus." But Nehirabed shook his head. "I am a worshipper of only one God, great and good," he replied slowly, "who defends the noble and the brave, and who abhors sacrifices." "What is this god called, my lord?" Melocles asked. "Men call him Ahura Mazda. It means the Just One," replied the old man. Chapter 3. My Special Friend. On the same day, at the same hour, in the Guardian's palace in the city of Carthage, a council was held. In attendance were Asahan, the high priest of the temple of Moloch, Hiram, member of the Great Phoenician Council and head of the city guard, and Barcas, one of the richest merchants of the city. They sat in silence. Finally, Hiram shifted impatiently. "Where's this dog?" he asked Barcas. "He'll be here soon." "Is he Greek?" "Greek." "And you trust him?" "We pay him well, and he is smart enough to know on which side his barley cake is oiled." Hiram nodded. "Better make this worth his while." The old merchant's face lengthened. "And what is all this for, Asahan? You had him in your hand, that Persian." "He isn't Persian, he's a Mede." "Same difference. The plague on all Medes and all Persians. It will now cost us a fortune to recapture him. And you had him in your hand." "So I did, but the council said not to hold him by force." "But they did tell you to be careful, yes?" "My guards had orders not to let him out of the gate." Barcas shrugged. "So he jumped over the wall. How hard was that to foresee?" "What? Old age, Asahan, old age. It does not sharpen the acuity of the mind, does it?" Agitated, Asahan rose sharply. "Hiram, do not allow Phoenician dignitaries to be offended in your house." "And what if this dignitary acted like a baby?" "Barcas, Asahan slammed the table with his palm. "Hiram, I'm saying this to you because this dog, although my relative, is not worth human speech. I was told to treat this Mede like an honoured guest and not hurt him. What was I supposed to do? And now everyone is after me for letting him get away. Both the prince and the highest council. Everyone on poor little me. But they made him an honoured guest, yes?" "They said that because he is an envoy and a priest." "High priest, actually, but not an envoy."
"Well, if he isn't an envoy, then why take so much trouble with him? If he had fallen somewhere, down some convenient stairs, and hurt his neck, who would have complained?"
"Hiram, now you speak like a child. If anything happened to him here, would you then go to Medea?"
"Why would I go there? I have no business there."
"You don't, but our brothers, the Phoenicians of Tyre, Cyprus and Sidon, do."
"Well, if he had just disappeared, who would have known why?"
"And if our men then started disappearing in Medea, no one would know why either, yes?"
"All right, but we could have detained him by force."
"Yes, by Moloch, and we should have done just that. But the Supreme Council did not order him imprisoned, and there is little point arguing about it now."
"But why imprison him?"
"Because he knows too much. He's been everywhere, sniffing."
"Why was he here, this Persian?"
"Not a Persian, a Mede."
"Whatever, that priest."
"Not a priest, a high priest."
"Same thing," said Barcus with exasperation.
"It is not the same thing at all." Asahan was offended. "There is actually a big difference between a priest and a high priest. You have never heard of high priests, Barcus? As in Chaldean high priests?"
"Oh, yeah. Clever fellows, they say."
"Clever? Too clever for you. And have you heard about Median mages?"
"Say what?"
"Oh, gods, he has not heard of the mages. Do you know, they are even smarter than the Chaldeans. They know more than the sages of Egypt. They know such arts that the head swells to hear about them. It's scary just to think about these guys. Okay, Barcus?"
All right. I did not know that in other countries high priests were so wise."
"Barcus!" Hiram broke into the conversation quickly.
"You have not yet told me why this Persian was hanging around here."
"This Mede?"
"Yes, this Mede."
"Hiram, no one should know that."
"Okay, but I'm not no one, and if you know, I'll know."
"What I say must fall as a rock falls into the deep sea, Hiram."
"Fine."
"So he, that Mede, came here to make peace between Phoenicians and Greeks in Egypt."
"Huh? What does he care?"
"He wants Egypt to be strong."
"I don't get why this matters to us. But what's that to him? Is he an Egyptian?"
"No, but Egypt is an ally of Medea. This is, how should I put it, level 5 power politics. Okay?"
"No, I don't get it. Those are very distant countries. Why do we care if he wants to make peace in Egypt?"
Asahan and Barcus looked at each other with exasperation. "What do you mean, what do we care? Don't you understand this, Hiram? Don't you understand that the Greeks must be done away with, once and for all? It's either them or us. By Moloch, by the terrible Astarte, either them or us. Who's taking all the trade from us? Greeks. Who establishes colonies, trading posts, settlements everywhere right under our noses? Greeks. Who turns up now in places where we have been left alone to do our business for centuries? Who breeds like rabbits? Who builds more ships than we do? Who takes away our cargoes and our earnings?"
"Carthage is rich."
"Yes, and how much richer she would be if not for these damned Greeks."
They were already all over the north 50 years ago, but thankfully they left us alone here in Africa at least. And now? Ask Barcus how much he loses every year since that lousy Greek settlement in Cyrene went up. A pox upon Cyrene! Half the ships from the east no longer come straight to us, but transship in Cyrene. Or in Barca, that's another poxy Greek town in Africa, if you must know. And ask our partners in Egypt how they are faring. Same story. Who formerly ruled in Egypt? Egyptians? Gods, you are a child, Hiram. Egyptians indeed. Maybe in the past 1,000 years ago. But now it's our bankers, our treasurers, our advisers to His Holiness the Pharaoh. Bankers and consultants, you know. Even when the Assyrians ruled there for a while, Egypt wasn't a bad place for us. And now, yikes, there are already more Greeks than there are Phoenicians. And they keep pushing in from all sides. And most of all, into the army. So, who gets all the new offices, palaces, and honours? Damned Greeks is who. For their officers, for their chiefs, for their mangy dogs. Everything for the Greeks.
Asahan is right. We can't wait any longer. The longer we wait, the harder the future fight will be. So, let's do it now. It's either them or us. And now we have a good chance.
Hiram shuddered.
War, he whispered. Yes, we have to end with them once and for all. In Egypt and Cyrene and all over Africa.
Hiram groaned. War is a terrible thing.
Hiram, you are the commander of the guard, and you fear war?
And who is to be afraid of war if not me? You? You will stay at home with your musicians and your slave girls. And so will Asahan. It's me who will have to go out and get killed, yes?
Oh, don't be so scared, Hiram. Nobody's pushing you to attack the Greeks. We aren't here to fight. We'll let others do it.
Who?
Egypt.
Hiram nodded. His face lit up. Ah, well, that's different. That's Phoenician. That is prudent and rational. Etruscans fight for us in the north. The pirates prey on the Greeks at sea. And now, let's have Egyptians fight for us in Libya. I like that. But what does this have to do with this Persian?
This Mede?
This Mede.
I've already told you, Hiram. He wants to make peace between us and the Greeks in Egypt. And we want war because now is the best time for it. If this Mede goes to Egypt, he'll break everything we have fixed, and fix everything we have broken. He knows the Pharaoh, the nomarchs. He knows a lot, too much. He is completely unnecessary there. And now, thanks to the supreme vigilance of our city guard, he is free to go there.
That's bad.
Very bad.
So, you shouldn't have let him go. It would have been better to kill him.
But why? We only had to hold him here long enough for the ball to start rolling in Egypt. Then let him go wherever. It's never a good idea to kill a priest.
A high priest.
Right, a high priest. Big whoop, said Barcus.
Barcus, you are stupider than a young dog. You don't know what these high priests can do. Have you heard what happened to one of our princes in Cyprus? He received such a wise man as a guest, for an extended visit, a Chaldean. You know, one of those Babylonian fellows. And he wanted to get rid of him, so he gave him a roast of fattened dog for dinner every day.
So what? Dog is very good meat.
Yes, but Chaldeans don't eat it. Maybe they can't. Maybe they don't like it. I don't know. Maybe their god says no dog and no hanky-panky.
I get it. Go on.
Well, so this priest would not eat it. Anyway, he was polite and said nothing on the first day. Nothing on the second day either.
But on the 5th day he had had enough and left. Only on departure he said this to the prince. "I see, worthy prince, that you like dog meat very much. From now on, everything you eat will remind you of this delicacy." And he left. And you know what, Barcus? Many years have passed since then, and he, this prince, every time he eats something, it all tastes like dog fat. At first he kept changing cooks. Now he gave up. The poor man lost weight. He's ruined. I saw him. He said that even when he eats grapes, they reek of dog fat. Barcus shook his head.
"That's a swinish revenge," he said. "I didn't know they could do stuff like this."
"Well, never mind that. Now, let's talk about this Mede. How do we stop him? He isn't here any more." "No, he's not, indeed," Asahan confirmed, "because your guards keep a really good watch over the port." "Asahan," said Hiram sadly, "you got your tongue lashing from the Supreme Council. So did I. And what have I done? Yesterday, before daybreak, I sent a signal to our post on the Eastern Cape. They saw a boat and sent the fastest galley in pursuit, but the storm got in the way. Too late to do anything about that now. Better we ask Barcus what to do now, okay? And that is?"
"Ha!" said Barcus. "This is where my special friend comes in, my Greek friend. He'll fix all of this, never worry. He's going to set out today. He will take with him your servant, the one who knows this Mede and can identify him. They will go by fast ship straight to Syracuse."
"Why there?"
"The Supreme Council thinks the Mede must have gone there."
"Okay, then what?"
"Well, in Syracuse, your man will recognize this Mede and point him out to my man."
"And then?"
"And then my man will take care of business."
"What do you mean, take care of business?"
"I mean he will do something to prevent this dark from reaching Egypt."
"Pray, not kill him?"
Nah, better not. The High Council said better not to do this, maybe as a last resort."
"So, how is he going to stop him?"
"That's his business. He says it can be done. He is cunning and has his own friends in various Greek ports."
"Greek friends?"
"Greek friends. But you know how the Greeks are. They don't stick together worth squat. In fact, when we're not around, they're at each other's throats like mad dogs. Every little town does what it wants."
At that moment, Hiram's servant entered the chamber. "My lord," he said, "a Greek man has come to see you and is waiting in the vestibule."
"All right, let him in."
Asahan rose from his seat. "I'm going out," he said. "It is not fitting for my dignified office to come in contact with impure animals. You two already know everything there is to know. I'll send my servant here immediately, that fellow who saw the Mede, and who will go to Syracuse to identify him."
"Fine. Just tell me one thing, Asahan. What is this Persian's name?"
"This Mede's?"
"This Mede's."
"His name is... Well, it doesn't matter, because he can change names like sandals. But his mother called him Nehurabed." Chapter 4. If I say so myself. In those days, the city of Syracuse consisted of two parts. One, located on the small island of Ortygia, was the original Old Town, and had by then already existed for several hundred years, remembering perhaps the days of Odysseus. A narrow channel cut off this island from a much larger peninsula, where the newer and more modern part of the city lay. Old Ortygia was crowded, with 2- and 3-story houses piled one on top of the other, and narrow winding passages between them. There were few places in these streets where two carts could pass each other, and most were only accessible by foot. There were no gardens or greenery, and the traditional open-air courtyards of Greek homes were tiny here. Most of the residents were working poor and slaves. Even the square in front of the old town hall, the Boulaterion, was extremely small, not at all corresponding in size to the importance of this great city. Everything here was subordinated to one goal: to fit as many houses and people into the tiny space of the island as possible. Only one patch of land, near the spring of Arethusa, was surrounded by a small wreath of greenery: palms, rhododendrons, and quince trees. People crowded here because the island's position offered protection. Ortygia could be attacked only from the sea. This position determined the development of the city. From its very beginnings and for centuries, Syracuse had striven to become and remain, above all, a sea power. Centuries of investment paid off. Syracuse was, by now, one of the 3 largest commercial and naval ports in the entire Mediterranean, and she commanded the 3rd largest naval fleet in the world. Twice in her history was she to cross swords with the greatest maritime powers of her time. Once with Carthage, several decades after the events described here, and the second time with Athens, several dozen years after that. Both wars were to end in the defeat of her enemies, and the dates of those victories were to become the major turning points in the history of the entire Greek world. As the city grew, tiny Ortygia could no longer accommodate all of its inhabitants, and therefore the second part of the city was established on the mainland. This new part extended more widely and more freely, and soon exceeded the home island in size and splendour. The houses there were more spacious and richer. Behind their white walls, single-story villas stood in delightful gardens, and clumps of palm trees, fig trees, and olive trees swayed overhead in gentle sea breezes. Massive defensive fortifications protected the new city. A large sea wall was also built to protect the entrance to the Ortygia Channel between the island and the peninsula. South of this dam, between the shores of the 2 cities, was the port, full of countless boats, ships, barges, and great war galleys. And into this port, on the 3rd day, came the little boat of the runaways from Carthage. Callias's house was in the newer western part of Syracuse, near the sea and the great defensive walls enclosing the city from the land side. But it was not possible to moor the boat here because the shore was a steep cliff and the sea was full of treacherous rocks. And so they left the boat at a considerable distance from the house, where the shore descended gently towards the sea, allowing it to be hauled out on dry land. They arrived at dawn, and almost immediately went to Callias's house for a well-deserved rest. Everyone slept the whole day through. But in the evening, as was customary, all the neighbours and friends of Callias, and friends of these friends, and all his relatives and relatives of these relatives, gathered in a great throng to listen to the stories of the returning traveller. There came so many of them that the house and its courtyard could not accommodate them all, so they sat down on the waterfront in front of the house. They brought wine, wheat and barley cakes, olives and cheese, and began to feast and make merry, laughing and joking, surrounded by a crowd of playing children. Callias, the most important person of the moment, sat down in the middle of the crowd on a large boulder, and talked long and colourfully about all his recent adventures, embroidering richly. Greeks love such stories, enjoyed them like children, not really caring whether everything in them was entirely true. Only one thing was shameful in a storyteller, and that was when he was boring, unable to frighten or delight his audience. Of this, however, there was no fear. Even when nothing remarkable happened to him, Callias could talk about it in fascinating and entertaining ways, even more so now, when he really did have something to tell. The word of their adventure had spread somehow, even as the runaways were sleeping. So the crowd turned up in large numbers, expecting a good tale. They plied Callias copiously with wine, clapped hands, cheered, asked questions. And Callias, excited by the party, warmed by wine, looking at the enraptured faces of the listeners, talked, added, twisted, and told it all. What had been and what could have been, and what had not been at all. And thus, according to him, as they were leaving Carthage, several guard galleys had spotted them at the entrance to the port, and chased them for several hours, and only thanks to Callias's agility and to the darkness of the night had they managed to get away safely. He described the details of the chase so poignantly, about how they had heard the voices and saw the lights of the galleys surrounding them, that not only all the Syracusans, but even Melicles himself trembled with excitement and suspense. Callias then went on to relate their encounter with the pirate boat. "The robbers," he said, "were so close now that they began pelting us with arrows. We, of course, were not idle, and I myself, you know how good I am with the bow and arrows, am pleased to tell you that I shot one of these scoundrels right in the face. He got it so good that he didn't even manage a yelp. He just keeled over the side and, whoop, plunged into the sea. That served him right. By Hermes, I tell you, it was a damn good shot, comrades." The horror of the story and the audience's excitement came to a crescendo when Callias showed his chiton, pierced through by an arrow. In fact, it was torn already in Syracuse as they pulled the boat ashore. Everyone was moved. Nehurabed, who appeared at the door of the house and listened to the story, only shook his head in admiration. Callias spoke primarily of himself, of course, but he did not spare words of praise for the others, for the helmsman who had seen the coming of the wind just in time, and who, by turning the boat around, probably saved them from sinking, and for Melicles, who had grabbed a sword, ready to defend himself, and later helped pilot the boat in the storm, and for the foreigner, who had stood ready to fight hand to hand alongside them, despite his, advanced decrepitude. When Callias finished, there was shouting and applause. Everyone took him in their arms and hugged him, inquiring about the minutest details. "We have not heard such a story in a long time," they all said unanimously. Then Melicles, in turn, had to tell his own story, how pirates had attacked his uncle's boat between Massilia and Parthenope, how he fought, how he was wounded, how he worked and suffered in his inhuman captivity, how he tried to escape, was recaptured, and condemned to a cruel death, and how, at the last minute, Callias and the mysterious foreigner turned up to rescue him. He didn't speak, it must be understood, as well as Callias, but truth shone in his story, and the audience did not spare him words of sympathy and appreciation. Then the conversation turned to other topics. Some old Greek described a recent battle against the Etruscans, whom he had been obliged to fight when a storm forced him on the Etruscan shore during a journey from Massalia to Cumae. Someone else described how, in a similar battle against the Etruscans 2 years ago, he had been captured and then escaped to take refuge among the Ramans. He spoke of the great city of these Ramans called Rama, or Roma, and which was almost as beautiful as Syracuse, except it lay inland, far away from the shore. Most of the listeners already knew these stories, but listened to them willingly again because nothing could be more pleasing to a Greek than to experience travel in this way, learning about foreign peoples, countries, cities, their mysteries, monsters, and dangers. Night fell. The moon rose over the bay, distant hills disappeared in the black night, and they still chatted, remembering old times, mocking a little, and making fun of each other and themselves. Only the chill of midnight, as it was already late autumn, drove them home at last. Then busy days began for Melocles. Busy but calm and measured, full of steady work on the boat, replacing worn-out planks, sewing a new sail, repairing damaged nets, twisting and coiling ropes, hewing new oars. These activities filled his whole day. There was a lot of work, and Callias was both demanding and quick-tempered, but Melocles felt joyful and happy. He knew this work well. The son of a sailor and a fisherman, the nephew of a ship's carpenter, familiar from childhood with such life, he performed well, and Callias found him useful. This did not save him from the Syracusans' anger on several occasions, because Callias could not live without such outbursts, but they were never too dangerous. Whenever the boy took these displays of displeasure too much to heart, Callias became a little abashed, smiling kindly, joked, and, patting him on the shoulder, repeated, "Come on, boy. When you stay with me, with Callias, you will learn it all perfectly." But he treated the boy better every day. "Indeed, it is a good thing that we saved this kid," nearly escaped his lips one evening as he spoke to Nehurabed. The mysterious stranger remained a guest in Callias's house throughout his stay in Syracuse. The Greek was clearly pleased with this, first because the hospitality was not free, but also, and above all, because the man's presence added weight and splendour to his house. He told everyone about Nehurabed, explained that he must be a very important person, probably an ambassador, maybe even a prince or great priest or fortune-teller, and, most likely, all of the above. He treated Nehurabed with great deference, especially in the presence of others, so that everyone might see what kind of an exalted guest he, Callias, had in his house. As always, Nehurabed took it silently and indifferently, which only increased the mystery. The Greek did not know much about him now than he had known before, but he soon learned that the old man had been to the town hall and the council's palace, and to Praxileos himself, the deputy of the absent tyrant of Syracuse. Nehurabed was an important person, it seemed, whoever he was. Melocles rarely saw Nehurabed now, since he spent whole days working on the boat, and even slept by it every other night, unrolling his mat on the wide bench at the stern. However, whenever they met, the distinguished guest always asked him in detail how his work went, how he liked it, and how long he had committed to working as a labourer for Callias. The boy looked at him with the same respect and awe as before, but these feelings were now connected, in a strange way, with a growing, blind, almost childish trust. He also sincerely regretted that the old man was leaving Syracuse in a few days, on his way to Greece or Egypt, and he thought with sadness about the upcoming goodbye. And then an accident happened, which again turned his life upside down.